Thank you so much for coming. This is an awesome turnout. Hopefully most of you at this point have gotten a moment to look around this show and take things in. It's kind of set up to be kind of a slow burn of an exhibition where you should leave with a lot to think about. It shouldn't necessarily hit you all at once. It's meant to provoke contemplation and deeper examination of the issues that all the different artists are kind of hitting upon. And I will talk about the evolution of this exhibit and the different artists involved in our work in a moment, but I'll just start with talking a little bit about my personal background and how I came to do the kind of work that I do. I consider myself a multidisciplinary contemporary artist. So I'll first talk about how that happened and how I got to this point. So basically I grew up in a small town in Vermont. Most of the towns are small in Vermont. So basically on the Canadian border. I grew up on a rural farm. Didn't have much of a larger worldview or much exposure to the world outside of my small town. But I didn't like winter, and I kind of was over it by the time I was 18, and I didn't get into any colleges that I wanted to go to. I didn't really know what my direction was, except I thought I wanted to be a biologist at the time. And so I took this opportunity to do some coral reef conservation work in Mexico that I had heard about through the internet, because basically a friend of mine told me to look on the internet for opportunities of what to do next with my life. So I was 18 and I ended up in Mexico for 3 months doing this conservation program. So terrified. I'd taken French for 8 years. I couldn't even count to 10 in Spanish when I arrived. But by the end of those 3 months, I was so enchanted, and I came home, raised money, and I was I'm going back, much to my parents' dismay. And I ended up living in Central America, and mostly Mexico remained my hub for the next 18 months. And while I was down there, a cousin of mine who grew up in Tucson, my dad is from Tucson, so I have family roots there. So this cousin of mine, she came down and visited me, and she was like, "You should move to Tucson after you're done doing whatever you're doing down here." And I was like, "Okay, I will." And I just obediently stuck to my word, and when I was 20, I drove all my things from Vermont to Tucson, where I've been for the last almost 14 years now. So yeah, in that 18 months that I was living down in Mexico, I learned Spanish. I replaced all my French with Spanish. I don't speak any French now. And moved to Tucson afterwards, ended up there, and then I kind of, at that moment in Tucson, and that moment throughout the US, was kind of a big moment in the larger immigrant rights movement. There was a lot of motion, things were really in motion, and all of a sudden you were seeing these huge, very well-attended immigrant rights marches pop up all over the country. So that's kind of the moment that I arrived. And in Arizona, especially Tucson, a lot of that had to do with a lot of that was in sort of conflict or in protest to anti-immigrant legislations that were being passed and things like that, things that were coming down, actual laws and legislation that were specifically dealing with immigration. So that was part of the larger conversation when I moved there. And so I got really caught up in it. And what I got from it at that time was some really interesting political and historical context to things I had experienced living in Mexico, that since I had no larger worldview or context at that time, it really kind of helped me put some pieces together, because our countries are really different. And I experienced a lot of things I'd never experienced before, and I was really like kind of excited to be given some more information. So I also was enrolled in college in Tucson, and so I gravitated towards a lot of arts classes, because that's another thing that happened in Mexico. I realized I didn't like biology, and I ended up painting murals on the walls of the research center instead of like being that excited about like the actual conservation work that we were doing, or like the research that we were doing. So that was another like light bulb that went off. So I came to Tucson, and I got really active in that larger immigrant rights movement, and also in the arts. And so I took a lot of like art classes, and also like the history of the Mexican American in the Southwest, and like political science classes to kind of help me piece these concepts together, and a lot of like help me kind of bridge experiences I had just had living abroad with what I was seeing, you know, in the streets in Tucson. So that was kind of a moment where things started, my art and political life, or like at least my academic like study, were starting to blur together. And I was using my art a lot to kind of be an extension of my activism. So that included like plays that I wrote and directed, and kind of the like following a certain tradition of like street theater. I painted a lot of banners and a lot of murals, and was just involved in a lot of projects that were artistically based but felt like they were an extension of my activism. And so that's kind of been something that's continued throughout my career, although I'm definitely approaching things in a very different way now, and I definitely am not on like the front lines of any sort of particular political or social movement, as much as I'm kind of sitting in the background, observing, asking questions, and then kind of generating work that is kind of speaking to what I'm thinking, but also is like pursuing this like cultivation of larger discussion and oh, okay. So that's where I was probably like in 2008. I graduated from Prescott College, but I never actually attended Prescott College here in Prescott. They have this thing called the Adult Degree Program, which is not campus-based, and basically you choose your own mentors in the community, you design your own classes, and you design your own major. So my field of study was public art with an emphasis on social impact. And so I got that degree in 2008. And that degree program and its model, and the whole time I was also taking classes at Pima Community College in Tucson. So I was kind of, you know, getting some like very traditional classroom instruction, which I really liked, to balance out this very like free-form, independent study model that I was pursuing with Prescott. So the greatest thing that I got out of my degree work, and so I got a bachelor's in 2008. So the best thing I got from that model, that the Prescott Adult Degree Program really taught me, was if there's anything you're interested in, find someone who's an expert in it and ask them to teach it to you. And that model has kind of served me and been the backbone of my just process ever since. And it's really been like the most valuable thing that I learned, because that's how that program was really structured. If you found a mentor, whether they were a PhD or they had never gone to school, if they could demonstrate that they were an expert in their field, they could be qualified as your mentor for that class, or sometimes a series of classes that you design with them. So through that, I worked with a lot of public artists. I worked with a lot of activists. Like one of my main mentors in like the social and like historical component of my degree work, she worked with Cesar Chavez on the grape boycott and had a very long, and before that she was working as a radical nun in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, working with the Black Panther Party, and so she had a really interesting history, and I learned a lot from her. And then there was a lot of artists that I worked with as well. And yeah, from that point on, I kind of like knew what the formula was. If there was something I wanted to learn, I would find someone who knew how to do it and ask them to teach me. And so in that way, I've always been able to kind of build upon my skill set. I started as a painter, and that was my main medium for a really long time. And I applied that in all kinds of different ways. I've restored a lot of historic murals all throughout the country and historic architecture as like a paying gig for a long time. Commissioned mural work, commissioned design and illustration work. So that was kind of, anything with a brush was my bread and butter, my backbone for a while. And as I was getting exposed to more and more contemporary art, I just was starting to gravitate towards video work and installation work, building. Then I got into working with theater companies for a long time as a designer and set painter, but that eventually led me to learning a lot of carpentry. So I was finally able to like break into this three-dimensional realm, which was really exciting because it just like opened up all of these opportunities that I had for what I could make. And so that's kind of where I am right now. I work at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tucson. Before that, I was a teacher at the Pima Community College in the theater department. Kind of my jobs have always included a level of problem solving, whether it was in the theater, like how do we make this, one, for really cheap, two, like really fast, and three, like so it looks good and right. And now at the museum, where artists will come to us and have all kinds of really crazy, outlandish ideas, and our job is to just say, yes, we can figure this out, like we'll make it happen somehow. So all of that, I've always used my work too as an educational platform, and I've always sought out jobs that kind of allow me to build my skill set. So that brings me to like 2015, when I was reading in the news about this cross-border shooting, and a 16-year-old boy named Jose Antonio Elena, he was shot by a Border Patrol agent. The Border Patrol agent actually shot through the border wall from Nogales, Arizona, into Nogales, Sonora, and killed him on the spot. And I was really, really affected by this story because in all my time in Tucson, I had spent a really long time, like a lot of time in Sonora, Mexico. I had a lot of friends there. I was part of like an activist community, but also an artist community there. And this just felt really, really close to home. There's a lot of tragedies that have occurred along the US-Mexico border, a lot of deaths from all different causes, mainly people trying to cross from Mexico into the United States and dying in the desert. The toll has been huge. But this, for whatever reason, this one incident of the 16-year-old boy being shot right in the middle of town, he was standing in front of a residential house at the time, really affected me and affected other friends. So one of my friends, he's a songwriter, and he wrote an incredible song about that incident. And right after it was written, I felt really motivated. I was like, I've never done any video work. I've always wanted to do animation, and I really want to work with this song. and I really want to work with this issue. There was just a lot that I needed to work out about that, because I just see myself as like a resident of Tucson, a resident of the Southwest, a resident of that region. I feel like all of these individual immigration stories make up the larger narrative of my home. So it's hard for me to just ignore things and move along. So I asked permission to use the song. I applied for some grant funding from the Tucson Pima Arts Council and was awarded funding, which allowed me a year to work on this project. And so Of Rocks and Bullets, an animated discourse, was born in 2017. And when I was creating the video, so that's what's housed in this installation right here, this like green viewing booth. As I was making it, it was really important to me that the piece wasn't like a standalone piece that you just took in and then everyone got up out of their chairs and left the room. I really wanted to make sure that it could promote a larger dialogue, or at least kind of create a moment of reflection from all the viewers that took in the work. So I then kind of started conceptualizing and designing this idea for a viewing booth where you would take it in as an individual, so you weren't seeing it as part of a crowd. You're having more of like a personal exchange with the piece. There's like these little cubbies. One has rocks in it, one has bullets in it. And the reason the piece is called what it is, and the reason that it has rocks and bullets as part of the installation, is because the Border Patrol officer's defense was that the boy was throwing rocks over the border and therefore justifying the bullets. And this is not a singular narrative. This is actually, there's been many, many incidences of particularly young men being shot on the Mexican side of the border by Border Patrol agents because of rock throwing. So that's kind of taking a step back from this one particular incident. I really wanted to just look at that larger idea of like what equals what and what should yield what. So created this piece, and another built-in aspect to it is this like table and receptacle to contain or collect all of the personal responses. It really invites every viewer, if they want, to take a moment and just create some sort of reflection. And that means you get a blank page, you could write whatever you want on it, or you could just cut it into like a papel picado, which is, if you've probably seen before, like banners of cut paper is like a traditional craft in Mexico. I thought there was like a powerful idea, or is kind of exploring this idea of like holes being put in something as a reference to the actual incident itself. But to take a moment, it just invited people to take a moment to think about the incident, think about issues that the video raised. And then an idea was to take all of those responses and continue making work with those. So those responses would then become a collective body of work on their own. And so from those, I've made a series of projection screens. And that's what you'll see like straight back on the other side of the cube here. You can see a projection screen that I made of a collage with all of these actual responses from this work. People putting their energy into these sheets after, while they're thinking about basically just violence on the border. Most broadly, it's just about violence on the border, border militarization, and just all the consequences of those things. So it's kind of a living work, and that's what I really try to do with my work, is kind of let it have a life beyond my impact on it or beyond my creation of it, to kind of give the public an opportunity to plug themselves into it somehow and just make it evolve from there. So every response and then all of the collages are basically just a public record of discourse around these topics. And that's another interest I have, is someone who's like a documentarian or an archivist, and like I think it's important. Social movement has been happening throughout history, and I think it's very important to document it when you can. And so that's another thing that my work aims to do. So I created this piece and debuted it in April of 2017, and in a year it showed at some pop-up events and then longer stints in the Museum of Art in Nogales, Sonora, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tucson. So it had basically a year to be shown to the public on both sides of the border, and so solicited responses from a really diverse array of communities. And you can see from the responses that it kind of hit people in a variety of ways. And there's a variety of responses that came from it. You could definitely tell when school groups had been taken to one of those museums, because there'd be a lot of like obvious teenage responses that were just, their heads are totally in a different place entirely. But I think that's really powerful too, because you see, they're records of these kids being young and getting to be kids and getting to just goof off because they're like on a school trip in a museum and someone gave them a piece of paper and a pencil, So I think all of the responses have been really interesting in their own ways, and I think they're all precious in their own ways. And I'm really excited to have gotten here after it's been up for a month to see a full receptacle of more responses from this community here. So that piece debuted with all of this other work and with all of these other artists. As I was finishing up this piece, I was like, okay, well, I've spent a year working on this, and now I want to share it with the community. And I was really trying to figure out what the appropriate way to do that would be. So I had a friend, my friend Jennifer Hijazi. She was finishing up her degree in journalism, and she had this body of work of photographs, but also 360-degree videos that she had taken at 4 different international borders around the world. 2 in the Middle East, 1 in the US-Mexico border, and 1 in the US-Canada border. She set her 360 camera on these international borders and took, simultaneous 360 footage at each of these places. Then she stitched them together and superimposed audio interviews from each of those places. She would seek out local residents who wanted to talk to her about their reflections of that place. Because I think there's just a lot of interesting things to say about international boundaries and a lot of really specific issues that are very specific to those types of areas. So that's what she was exploring with her work. And I was like, well, that's really interesting and complementary to what I'm doing. And what I really liked about her work is that it stepped even further back and it looked at borders all over the world and took personal stories from each of them. And I was like, that's really complementary to what I'm doing. Let's maybe present our work together. And she had gotten close with Connor, who at the same time was finishing up his MFA at the University of Arizona. And he was a Peace Corps volunteer in El Salvador, I believe. And I think that was a really formative experience for him. So he came back to do his MFA in photography at the U of A. So he was finishing up and he had this body of work that he wanted to present as well. And so we had the 3 of us together, and I said, there's one more person that I really want to include in this exhibit. And that was a longtime friend of mine, Jason Aragon. And he's the one who has the video inside the cube. He's someone that I've seen on the streets of Tucson at different activist events or immigrant rights events for the past 15 years he's been at it. He's one of the founding members of Pan Left, which is an organization in Tucson that teaches basically anyone who wants to learn like community documentary filmmaking skills, teaches them and lends them the equipment to do it. So they work with a lot of youth, and they just try to teach and empower anyone who wants to record their personal experience in their own communities to give them the resources they need to do that. So he's a really cool person, and he's been documenting this movement and this changing movement in Tucson for a really long time. And I was like, Jason, I know you have tons of footage. Would you create an edit for this show? Because I thought what was missing was some kind of tie-in to this like kind of grassroots context that was going on at the same time as like incidents like the Jose Antonio Elena shooting was happening. And Connor's piece is very political in its way, but it looks at retirement communities and their proximity to the US-Mexico border in southern Arizona, and just reflects on how, one population has kind of, as far as with their voting power, a lot of control on the other population, or, there's definitely influencing going on there. There is some sort of relationship, and he thought it was really interesting to explore that in his work. And then Jennifer's just gives a nice broad view of this isn't just happening on the US-Mexico border. This is happening all over the world. Wherever there is an international border, there is, there's conflict and there's struggle, and there's violence a lot of the time in different ways and different kinds. So I was like, I thought Jason's work could really kind of lend a very contemporary viewpoint too, of like, this is what's going on, and these issues have been happening, but this is also what one community's response has been, and what their mobilization has looked like over the years. So he put together an edit, and I just loved it, and I was like, yes, this is the missing piece. So we approached a gallery in Tucson that specializes in video work, and we approached them for a one-night showcase of all of our work, and we called it Peripheries. And we had a really, really successful opening where we raised money for a local organization called Mariposas Sin Fronteras, and they raise money to advocate for LGBTQ immigrants who are in detention centers. And so we raised a ton of money for them, and we were just really excited about how it went and what the feedback was. And from that point on, we kind of sought out other venues to bring this collective body of work to just kind of keep these conversations going, because ultimately that is what that's what we're going for. That's what all of us are going for with our work, even though we have very different approaches and different aesthetics. One thing that we're all really interested in is like discussion and examination and exploration of these issues, not just taking them at face value, but digging deeper and really trying to see the human face on every side of the issue. So that's what we were hoping for. And yeah, it's been really exciting to bring that to Prescott and to just kind of feel how like northern Arizona is different than southern Arizona in a lot of ways, just about like what's on the general radar here. It's like Tucson and its very close proximity to the US-Mexico border creates a very distinct feeling and atmosphere, and so that's really on our radar there. And please correct me if I'm like making a generalization about that. But yeah, I just thought that was it was really interesting, and I've had different conversations here surrounding the work than I would have in Tucson generally. And so we were just really excited to bring it to a different part of Arizona. And yeah, really appreciate you all coming out. And if you've seen the work before and you have questions about it, please ask. And if you haven't seen the work and have questions about what I just said, please ask. Yeah. Oh, well, I was selected for another piece that I did after this one. I was selected by the Sharjah Art Foundation, which is in the United Arab Emirates. I was part of their official selection for their film festival. So that's a contemporary art foundation. So it was a really interesting film festival in that it was like a mix of like video artists and filmmakers, which are kind of separate breeds. You know, like a bunch of us considered ourselves contemporary artists, and a bunch of themselves, like a bunch of others considered themselves filmmakers. So it was a really interesting kind of collision of different worlds, because, you know, people would introduce themselves as like, I'm a producer, or like I'm, you know, a script editor, or whatever, and I'd be like, I did everything on my film, you know, like. So that was really fun. And also just being on the other side of the world and in the Arab world, which is a place I've never traveled, was really interesting. And I had a lot of amazing conversations and saw a lot of amazing work from Arab artists. And you just realize, I am not exposed to this in the US. I'm not exposed to, I mean, a lot of the films were really progressive, very political in their own right, really talking about their sense of place in their respective countries. And it was just a fabulous opportunity to be exposed to something that we don't regularly get exposed to here. So yeah, that was a whirlwind that I am just getting back from.
What was your film that you had to have your work?
It's a film that's called Prototype. So I showed this work at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tucson, and from it was selected for a group show about borders, which was really interesting because it was like a good mix of US-based artists and Mexico-based artists, and just explored different ideas, very broad, like conceptually, of what borders could be. It was called Nothing to Declare. And the main kind of exhibition centerpiece for that show was this replica or prototype of the US-Mexico border wall, but within President Trump's specific specifications. So at that time, when this artist conceptualized it, Trump put out this request for proposals to different contractors to, you know, build me a prototype, and the best one will win the government contract to build the border wall. So he included a bunch of specs for what that border wall needed to be. And so this artist created something that fit those exact specs that were in the RFP. And so he showed the US side, and then he showed the Mexico side, and you would walk around the piece and there'd be very, very different, they'd have very, very different feelings. On the Mexico side, it was all filled with debris that he had collected in the desert on these migrant routes. And there's also all these photographs that he had taken of migrants on the Mexico side of the border right before they were about to embark on their journey through the desert. So it was a really cool, very powerful piece. So this was part of that show. And for that show, I approached the curator, and I was like, I've always wanted to do, or I've been thinking about how cool it would be to work with youth and to explore the concept of borders and concept of the border wall with young people, and have them make drawings for me that I would turn into an animation. And so she was like, great, we have an after-school program here at the museum. How about you work with them from September to December of this year and teach the class, lead the workshops every week, and collect all the drawings you want, and then when you're done with the film, we'll screen it here at MoCA. So I did that, and I worked with the amazing education programmer there, and he and I sat and planned the project for a while, and it was his brilliant idea to include college-aged youth too and high school-aged youth. The after-school program was 8 to 11-year-olds. So I was working with the 8 to 11-year-olds every week, and we would draw the border wall exhibit. We would have just a lot of just open conversations where I really was just like, what do you guys think when I say this? What do you see in your minds? I was not trying to feed them any information, but I really wanted to see what was in their imaginations already when you just brought up, here's a headline from the news today. What does that make you think of? And why don't you draw it for me now? Just to see what was brewing in there in these young minds and how they grasped these really heavy, larger issues. Then I worked with my friend's art appreciation class at Tucson High School and had her interview all of her students about what are your experiences with the U.S.-Mexico border. Just so happened in her class, pretty much everyone except one student had a very, very direct experience with the U.S.-Mexico border. One of the students' mother had been deported. One of the students' parents had crossed the desert. A lot of them had family on the other side and would talk about what it was like to have to go and travel to a different country to see their families, but their families couldn't travel to see them. Just really powerful and really made you realize, wow, when you live in the borderlands, so many people have these very direct experiences. And so I wanted to capture that. So the high school students provided the audio, the 8 to 11-year-olds provided all of the drawings, and then the college students provided words. I would go and meet with my other friend's class and at Pima Community College and have them generate one-word answers to prompts. And so those one-word answers are kind of circulating in the background while all of this other stuff is going on. And that piece is called Prototype, and that's what I showed there. Yeah.
I just wanted to inform you that the social justice community here in Prescott,
Mm-hmm.
we work with the Phoenix Restoration Project, we work with All Hands Arizona, Granite Peak Unitarian, they have an effort to supply water to various routes along the border. We have through Prescott College community group called Keep Prescott Together
Huh.
that offers assistance for people that are here to get their path to citizenship. And an organization that I work with, Prescott Indivisible, we sponsor 10 scholarships for DACA students. So even though the border is not here,
Yeah.
it is with us.
Awesome.
So just,
Thank you for letting me know.
with you.
And I should have definitely done my research, but
Can't know. Have to live here.
well, and that's a big thing about my work is what makes up our sense of home and and how we make assumptions and generalizations about different people, different places. I mean, that's just a huge thing I'm always grappling with in my work and in my own life, where I'm just I don't see the direct connection because it doesn't get to be 115 degrees here. When you have a 115 degree day in Tucson, in the back of my mind, it's always it is so hot today, and we all kind of know what that could potentially mean and how dangerous it is out there right at this moment. But we are a large state, and we all are kind of, I'd say, there is this umbrella of, well, first of all, our elected officials and our larger policies kind of all keep us part of this larger conversation, for sure. But those are really cool programs that I just learned about. Any other questions?
I just want
thank you so much. Yeah, for taking it in. Like, that's the thing. It only really exists with if there's a viewership for it, and like it has a better life the more people want to engage with it and talk about it and talk to each other about it. And so that's always the baseline for what I am trying to do, is to just kind of let these things have a ripple effect, have my projects have more of a ripple effect. Even if it just affects one person, it's like, I don't know, becomes worthwhile for me to do. So thank you for all being interested enough to show up.
In terms of the difference between your art and film, filmmakers and the contemporary artists, is it the interactive element that is what is the difference between what you do and what they do?
I think there's like an experimental aspect of my work that definitely sets itself apart from traditional filmmaking, but there's, I mean, tons of different types of experimental film. What I noticed at the film festival that was really interesting to me is just the structures are really different. Just everything like a lot of people that I talked with, their projects were part of this huge collaboration. And I've worked on films before too, just doing like production design and stuff like that. And it's a really different world, and it has its own language and its own like slang terms, and it's just like the contemporary art world does. And that was like just a light bulb that went off when I went to this event, where I'm just like, oh yeah, these are two worlds colliding right now, and we all have our own secret languages within that. And then sometimes when we would try to like break through, it would just be like, wow, we just, like, someone was like, I'm a producer, that's what I do. Or I was like, what do you work on in film? She's like, production. I'm like, yeah, but what part of the production? She's like, production, that's like a department, you idiot. And I was like, I don't know. I don't know anything about this. Like, I do all the things with my films. I mean, a lot of them have collaborative elements where I'm, and I've done a lot of work in the Midwest too, because I have family roots, other family roots there. And they have, particularly in Minnesota, they have like a lot of interesting small towns with huge immigrant populations. And so I've worked with those and doing similar video projects like that, where I'll take interview footage and I'll make video from that. So it's like they're collaborations, but then at the end of the day, once I've assembled all of the materials, it's just me in a room for like weeks and weeks making it happen. But yeah, I think at some point those lines definitely blur. But I felt on one side of the spectrum, and I was meeting a lot of filmmakers who were like wanting to become Steven Spielberg one day. And we just have very different tracks that we're on. If that makes, I don't know if I answered your question.
I'm wondering about intent, if that's the difference.
No, I would say a lot of people were taking very traditional filmmaking approaches, but making very political or very like work that had a lot of social commentary behind it, at least. So, yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of times our intentions would overlap and be pretty aligned, but our approaches and the actual like tracks we were on and the different like worlds we were a part of would be different. So I mean, I think that's why the film platform, the Sharjah Art Foundation, like put us all together in one event. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? So I did want to mention that Jennifer's 360 videos are not up at the moment, but if anyone wanted a link to her 360 videos, you can just go on YouTube and kind of scroll around and kind of get the 360 experience. Just approach me and I'll give you my card. You can email me and I'll send you those links so you can experience that. Have you ever seen the Google Mobile go around? They have I mean, that's what that is. That's a 360 camera on top of their vehicle. So it's taking a 360 picture every moment. So the camera is the same thing. It's just a dome. I don't know how many lenses it actually needs to have, or I don't even know if it has lenses. Like, this is not my wheelhouse at the moment. But basically, it can just take live footage. She has to do something where she stitches it together. So it's definitely like registering a bunch of separate videos, but enough so that when she puts it into a program to stitch them together, you can put on those goggles, and actually, if you're looking to the west in real life, you're looking to the west that camera was seeing at that site. It's really crazy. But you get a lot of that just from the YouTube link, where you can just scroll around, and there's interviews that are part of it, and they're subtitled, so you can kind of get the stories embedded in them.
It is multiple lenses that coordinate. Often there's 8.
Thank you. 8 lenses.
In some cameras anyway. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because I was like, it must be outputted as separate files or separate videos, because I know she stitches them together. But that's pretty much all I knew. And when you decide to put subtitles on it, you have to kind of decide like which direction you want the subtitles to be looking at. Which, yeah, you can like put them on 2 sides, but I think she just put them on 1 side, because she's like, enough's enough. Like, it's a lot of work. So thanks for appreciating all the hard work that we put into these projects.